What's so special about flies? Jonathan Balcombe will be here to talk about his latest book, Superfly. What's wrong with most Holocaust books for children? Marjorie Ingall will join us to make a case for better books about Judaism for kids. Plus, my colleagues and I will talk about what we're reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. It's July 9th. I'm Pamela Paul. Jonathan Balcombe joins us now from Belleville, Ontario. His latest book is called Superfly, The Unexpected Lives of the World's Most Successful Insects. Jonathan, thanks for being here.
Good to be here, Pamela.
I have to ask immediately about that subtitle. Why successful? It's not greatest. It's not most exciting or most helpful. It's successful. What is success for a fly?
Well, I'd say a number of measures. Their diversity, for one. There's over 160,000 described species, and it's important to add that qualifier described because it's estimated there may be about 5 times that many that are undescribed. And consider just how numerous flies are and insects. Insects make up 80% of all animal species on the planet. So that says something right there about how incredibly successful they are. And flies are arguably the most species-rich subset of insects. It's estimated that there's about 20 million flies on Earth at any one moment for every human who's on the Earth. And they occupy all 7 continents. So those are just some of the measures by which we might conclude that flies are enormously successful.
See, all of those numbers to me are horrifying. And I guess, flies to me are the stuff of horror movies and also a very good short science fiction story on which those movies are made. What was the draw for you to look at flies this extensively and write an entire book about them?
The fact that they are so unpopular is one draw for me. I love to explore unpopular animals, and usually when one does that, one finds many reasons to like them. In the case of flies, we should recognize that they are vital pollinators. They rank second only to bees as the most important pollinators, and they're actually the champion pollinators at high latitudes and altitudes. They're also absolutely vital waste disposers. Yeah, that may give us a gross reaction when we consider that many flies clean up poop and rotting bodies, but if they didn't do that, the world would be a lot fouler and more pestilential place. And they're vital elements of food chains, both as predators and consumers of microorganisms and other insects and other creatures, but also as food for fishes, birds, mammals. They play an incredible role in making microbes bioavailable to organisms higher up in food chains. Microbes are just too small for other bigger animals to eat, but insects make that energy available. So that's another vital thing that they do.
All right, that's a lot of work that flies are doing. I want to go back to the first job you mentioned, pollination, because we generally associate pollination with bees. What do flies do specifically with regard to pollination? And it sounds like we don't have to worry about the collapse of flies the way we do worry about bees. Can flies do what it is that bees do? Can they replace bees in this regard, or how do they differ?
Well, hopefully we don't need to worry about them replacing bees, because hopefully we'll get our act together and the bees will get through their struggles that they're going through now. But flies basically do the same thing. They're drawn to the attractants that flowering plants produce, the bright colors, the nice smells, and the nectar reward. I should say not always nice smells in the case of fly-pollinated flowers. There's many flowers specialized for flies where they smell like unpleasant things to us, but things that are very attractive to flies. When you consider that 90% of the world's flowering plants, and there's about a 250,000 of flowering plants in the world, 90% of those are insect pollinated, and flies are, as I say, right up there with bees. It's estimated that the commercial value of insect pollination of plants is over $500 billion a year. And yet, when I went to the Montreal Insectarium a couple of years ago and saw a display in the lobby of champion pollinators, there was nary a fly in sight. Flies are often overlooked as pollinators.
Why?
Maybe the same reason we're having this interview is because we have bad reactions to them because of their association with filth and decay, and also the fact that mosquitoes are flies, true flies, and there are quite a few biting flies that wreak havoc on us, especially in the tropics. But even up here in Canada, where I live, I don't have a risk of getting malaria, but I do have plenty of risk of getting attacked and bitten when I go hiking in the woods.
I don't think most people think of mosquitoes as flies. They are, technically speaking, a kind of fly.
They are absolutely. They are members of Diptera, which is Greek for diptera, two wing, and that's the main characteristic that distinguishes flies from other flying insects. Most flying insects have four wings, but flies, their hind wing, a long time ago evolved into a baton-like structure that aids in balance and stability during flight. So they're two-winged, hence the name Diptera, and mosquitoes are very much part of that group.
All right, let's talk about what it is that actually makes a fly. You said earlier that there are 160,000 described species. What do you mean by described, first of all?
That means that some scientist somewhere has caught them and put them under a microscope and carefully teased out the characteristics. In the case of flies, some species are so similar that it comes down to the location and shape of a couple of bristles on the second leg, kind of thing. So it's quite a technical task to describe a species. It usually takes several years before it's formalized in a published article. I guess you'd say it's called taxonomy. It's the art and science, and there is kind of art to it as well, because there's usually beautiful illustrations of these creatures, and that's the job that some of these scientists do, is describing these species. And when I mention the other ones that are undescribed, it's they're out there, and they've probably been out there for a long time. It's just they haven't been described yet. If scientists put out nets in the tropics, in most of the tropics, about 95% to 100% of their sample will be of the flies will be undescribed, new species. So that's just says speaks to the undiscovered diversity out there.
Let's stick for a moment with the flies that we know. So, mosquitoes are flies. Are there other kinds of flying insects that we might be surprised to find out are also flies?
Most people have heard the words midges and gnats. Those are kind of popular names for flies. So there's a group called the phantom midges, there's frog biting midges, there's fungus gnats, hobgoblin flies, bee flies, which hover like bees, and then there's hoverflies, which mimic bees and wasps. And then there's actually, they're so good is their mimicry of bees that some honey companies have actually put pictures of what they thought were honeybees on their labels, when in fact that it was a drone fly that they put a picture of. And so these flies benefit by mimicking bees, because of course bees have a sting, and a lot of bee predators or would-be bee predators know that, and so they avoid bees, and so the flies get away with mimicking them.
Earlier, we talked about bees and the fact that there are fewer bees and bees are in jeopardy as a species. It sounds like flies are not in trouble. Are they affected, though, in certain ways by climate change or other human misdeeds, or are humans inadvertently making flies thrive even more?
No, I wish I could say they're unaffected by our depredations, but they're as vulnerable to pesticides, for instance, and herbicides as other insects are. And so when I talk about the studies showing declines in insect populations, and in particular in Europe, that's been documented in at least in more than one study, estimated a drop of about half of insect populations, flies included, in the last half century. And so flies are very much part of that. I mean, I should remind listeners that because their generation spans are short, they're much more evolutionarily nimble than we are. We're much more vulnerable to things like a pandemic. And, this COVID pandemic reminds us of our vulnerability, and that we don't run the show. Humans are not a special priority for nature. And I'm pretty confident in saying that a million years after the last human treads the earth, there'll be a fly perched on a leaf somewhere preening her wings.
You said their generations are short, and I think we're all familiar with fruit flies, which are very useful for scientific experiments because of that short lifespan. Are there flies that live for a long period of time? What's the average lifespan for a fly?
Fruit flies are probably pretty typical, and as for most flies, their larval stage is longer than their adult stage. The adult stage may be a few weeks, and the larval can be a few months. I know that some flies, it depends on the circumstances. If there's little food available, they'll remain as larvae for much longer periods, up to 6 or 7 years in some cases that has been described. But some of them are the opposite of that. There's a few tiny midges who only live for a few hours as adults. Their complete role is to find mates and mate. And this time of year, you'll find these swarms of midges, usually near water. There's tons of them around here, and there's just like hundreds or thousands, sometimes tens of thousands of individuals in these swarms bouncing around really rapidly in flight. And those are mating swarms. They're trying to find good mates. and they're probably dead by the end of the day. So it's a very short adult life for them. They have spend much more time as larvae.
All right, since we just touched on their love life, or at least their sex life, give us a sense of how social flies are.
Well, certainly when it comes to sex, they become quite social. A lot of flies do hang out together. I was just mentioning the midge swarms, but in terms of sex and courtship, it's really quite colorful. Although I like to say that fly sex comes in 50 shades of brown. It's actually really complex and really interesting. There's gift giving, there's cannibalism, there's serenades, there are complex genitalia that require 180-degree rotation for correct interlocking. There's some fruit flies have giant sperm, and there's an interesting theories about how that evolved.
Are they all social? Are they like bees, where they are all in these complicated societies, or are some flies loners?
Yeah, I'd say most flies as adults are loners. They're not so much social as gregarious. They're drawn to the same things. So I wouldn't call that a social interaction, although I've seen cowpats in fields in Maryland where they've got these dung flies. They're called dung flies for obvious reasons, and they're running around, displaying to each other. Males are wrestling each other. Female male pairs are courting each other. It's really a very socially intense situation.
We usually think of mosquitoes as the disease carriers of the flying insect world. Are other kinds of flies carriers of major human diseases?
Unfortunately, yes, there are biting midges that can transmit dengue, leishmaniasis and encephalitis, for instance. I may have that wrong in terms of which species do, but there's a host of diseases, 15 or so, including, of course, the famous malaria. But there's a number of probably a few dozen biting species, and of course, there's the well-known tsetse fly of Africa. Just a side note about the tsetse fly, it is a blood feeder and it's drawn to any number of animals, including humans, if they're available. Their reproductive life history is very similar to ours. They have a womb-like apparatus. They produce one young in a year, just one baby, and they even produce a milk-like substance to feed them. So it's just an interesting side note about tsetse flies is the parallels between their reproduction and ours.
In what other ways are flies just like us?
I would say the fact that they're entrepreneurs, that they're opportunists, that they're incredibly adept at finding new ways to make a living. Humans are like that, and I can tell you, flies are like that too. They're remarkably adaptable, but they're not like us in their nimbleness. They're much more nimble than we are with our 20 year generation span. We're much slower to adapt to things, whereas a fruit fly with 25 generations per year is much more nimble. Maybe little wonder then that they're so popular in genetics research.
Are flies smart?
Well, they have minds, they have differentiated brains, structures like mushroom bodies and central complexes and protocerebrums. And careful studies on insects show that they show tool use. There's ants that have passed the mirror self-recognition test. There's face recognition. In the case of flies specifically, they have an attention span. They pay attention. There's a burst of activity in their brain if they see a new stimulus. But if you continue repeating that stimulus, they kind of get bored with it. It's like the way we do if something doesn't change, and then you put a new stimulus, and the brain gets excited again, and they're also distracted by that. These are the hallmarks of what we call attention span, and fruit flies show that. They also show rational decision making and transitive logic and a few other pretty cool cognitive skills.
How do they show rational decision making?
That was done with mating flies. So female fruit flies who could watch other female fruit flies choosing and mating with males, even if the scientists carefully manipulated the situation such that that male was actually not a very good quality male, the females who observed that would tend to select that male. Now, maybe that doesn't sound rational, but it shows a consciousness because they're making decisions based on what they observe. I'll have what she's having is kind of the phenomenon that's being described here. So that's the basis for that.
Of all these 160,000 described species, and probably, as you mentioned earlier, 5 times more other kinds, do you have a favorite or one that you admire or just really enjoyed learning about during your research?
Yeah, I mean, actually, no, because there's so many. It was an absolute
Hard to
joy
choose.
yeah, it really is. It was a joy to research this book because there were so many really neat discoveries. But I'll just give you one example. This is kind of grim, but there are flies in the tropics, tiny flies. They're phorid flies, they're called, and they are specialized in parasitizing ants. And there's some that are drawn only to injured ants. You know, ants get in scuffles with other colonies, and so you end up with injured ants lying about on the ground. And these flies are attracted to the smells and the chemicals that are emitted by these injured ants, probably formic acid. And the flies land, and you can watch videos of this on YouTube from the researchers who studied this. These tiny flies land near the ants and they start running around them. They run up and tweak them, and they pull a leg to see how injured the ant is. And if the ant is incapacitated enough, then that little fly will then proceed to get on the body of the much bigger ant and saw the head off with special mouth parts, and then drag the fly's severed head into a safe nook and proceed to live in that capsule for the next few weeks, feeding herself, presumably nourishing herself so she can lay a good batch of eggs later. I find that behavior quite remarkable, and it's very hard to watch those videos and not conclude that this is a conscious creature. This fly is conscious and quite aware of what she's doing.
All right, well, since you've sent us to YouTube to watch violent videos of flies, what else should we look up while we're there? Fly-wise, that is.
Fly-wise. Mating behavior in flies. There's a wonderful video. I think I even give the link in my book of a pair of, I don't remember which species, it may have been dance flies, but to see the sort of the foreplay, the tenderness between these two flies, there's kissing, other behavior. It's quite remarkable, and it's hard, again, it's kind of hard to watch it without making parallels to us.
Well, I don't know if you've entirely persuaded me to love flies, but completely fascinating subject matter. Jonathan, thank you so much.
Thanks a lot, Pamela.
Jonathan Balcombe's latest book is called Superfly: The Unexpected Lives of the World's Most Successful Insects. Tina Jordan joins us now to celebrate the 125th anniversary of the New York Times Book Review. Tina, welcome.
Hi, Pamela. So the story I'm going to bring you today actually predates the book review by a few short years, but I'm bringing it to you because I think it's one of my favorite all-time book items in the early New York Times, and because it came at a time when book coverage in the paper was just exploding. And these were the years that directly led to the creation of the book review. So this particular piece is called The Evil of Novel Reading. The mischief of voracious novel reading is really much more like the mischief of dram drinking that appears at first sight. It tends to make all other literary nourishment intolerable, just as dram drinking tends to make all true food intolerable. The habit of dram drinking, it is said, leads to fatty degeneration of the heart. So, too, the habit of exciting novel reading leads to fatty degeneration of the literary mind, to an unhealthy and spasmodic action of the imagination, and a general weakening of the power of entering thoroughly into the interests of real life. So far as we know, the only effective cure for this habit is a moral shock of some kind which exposes the hollowness of all these unreal interests. Now, I suppose somebody could say the same thing now about what? Playing video games?
I don't know, but I feel like this would be very bad news for many people I know who like both dram drinking and books.
Including me.
Thanks, Tina.
All right. Thanks, Pamela.
Marjorie Ingall joins us now from New York City. She is a former books and culture columnist for Tablet. She is the author of Mamala Knows Best. She is working on a book about apologies, which is something we all need. And this week, she writes an essay in the book review about Holocaust literature for children. Marjorie, thanks for being here.
Thanks so much for having me, Pamela.
I want to talk about this subject at hand of your essay, but I do want to pause for a moment on your last book, Mamala Knows Best. What was that about?
That was about the Jewish mother stereotype and how it fits in a very small span of Jewish history, and how in reality there is a reason, and it's not because Jews are smarter than other people, that Jews have done so well in both times of terrible anti-Semitism and times of acculturation. And it has to do with the values with which we have historically raised children. And it's sort of a call to harken back to those values of literacy and suspicion of authority and encouraging nerdiness and a feeling of outsiderness. So hopefully it's a funny social history and social science book.
Well, that leads us kind of naturally into the subject at hand because we want to talk about Holocaust books for children and Jewish books in general for children. Before we even get to that, though, let's just talk about books around the Holocaust generally, because I know you don't just read and review books for kids. What is that landscape like? Here at the book review, it is a given that in any year we will have dozens of books across our desk for all ages about the Holocaust. Why the ongoing interest?
Let's start by saying I think the motives are mostly good, that the idea is to educate people. We live in a time of increasing anti-Semitism. We live in a time of increased fragmentation among the Jewish community. Jewish communal people are worried about Jewish identity. I think to a degree, Jews are included in the We Need Diverse Books movement for kids, wanting to tell different kinds of stories, and that's commendable. But, and it's a big but, the Holocaust is such a important and terrifying topic. It needs to be treated with both historical accuracy and age appropriateness. And so many books fail this test. I also think that just as Black kids deserve more than books about slavery and suffering, they deserve books about Black joy and Black excellence. So too do Jewish kids deserve books that reflect the incredible diversity and often happiness of their lives. And I think sometimes we push the Holocaust because we want to tell kids, look where you come from, look how important it is to be Jewish, look how people died because they were Jewish. When we're talking about children's books, that is not a way to make kids feel a connection. That means the stories that these books are not telling are stories about Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, stories about other periods in Jewish history, stories about contemporary Jewish life that aren't just about Hanukkah, and stories that bring kids happiness.
It sounds like there are kind of three related things going on. One is that there are perhaps too many books around the Holocaust and that these books are not especially always well done. The second being that there aren't enough books around other aspects of the Jewish experience and Jewish history. And the third being that and this is where I think that analogy you brought up around books for Black children or about Black children is especially relevant. It doesn't sound like there are books where there are just Jewish characters who happen to be in stories around other things. So with books for Black children for a very long time, first of all, they were all relegated to Black History Month in February, but then also they were all around either slavery or the civil rights movement rather than just stories that might be an adventure story or a space story that just happened to feature children who were Black.
I know you and I are both big fans of Ezra Jack Keats and The Snowy Day, which was this absolutely groundbreaking book in that it was just this gorgeous book about a little Black kid loving the snow. And it felt revelatory at the time.
What's The Snowy Day for Jewish kids?
Oh my God, such a good question. I don't want to make it sound like great Jewish children's books don't exist. I have a bunch of favorites in every category. Thankfully, we have enough that I can pick what appeals to me as a secular reader as well as a Jewish reader. But I'm a big fan of, there is a new board book for little kids, since we started off with The Snowy Day, which most of us know as a board book, called You're the Cheese in My Blintz. It's rhyming, which I tend to be really wary of, but everything scans. And there's Buen Shabbat, Shabbat Shalom, which is in Ladino, which is the language that is not Yiddish, that is a hybrid of two languages. This one is Hebrew and Spanish and is spoken historically by Sephardic Jews. Among picture books, I can cry over and over and over again when I read Brave Girl, which is by Markel. I'm sorry, I don't know how to say her name. And it's the story of Clara Lemlich, who was a labor leader when she was a teenage girl. And I tend to really respond to books about immigration and the labor movement, even though I'm very aware a word that we used to use at Tablet all the time was Ashkenormative. You want to be sure you're not only showing the Ashkenazi Jewish experience, but because most books that are already meet the small little criteria of, is this a Jewish book, also are Ashkenazi. So there's one called Zisha the Strong Man by Karben, which is about a true story about a Jewish weightlifter. Fievel's Flying Horses is a story that I loved, a picture book about the fact that so many of the Coney Island and other carousel carvers, the wooden horses carvers, were immigrants who had made Torah arcs in the old country and came here and carved these beautiful, gorgeous carousel horses. So that one's a story about a guy coming over, and each horse he carves reminds him of a family member that he's saving money to bring over. Jean Lafitte, the pirate who saved America, is another one. I am drawn to history books, but you mentioned earlier books about kids who just happen to be Jewish. This year's Sidney Taylor Gold Medalist is a book called Dancing at the Pity Party. It's a graphic memoir by Tyler Feder, and it's a story of how her mom died when she was in college. And then I feel like I need to grab people by the lapels and say, but wait, because it's so funny and so touching. And it's actually a really nice guide to Jewish mourning practices and the comfort you get through them. To Night Owl from Dogfish, which I think you guys reviewed, which was Holly Goldberg Sloan and Meg Wolitzer, is so freaking funny. And it's like this Parent Trap, but with gay dads. And it's just incidental Jewishness, but it's so good. Oh, and Get a Grip, Vivi Cohen, which is one about an autistic 11-year-old girl who loves baseball and the epistolary relationship she has with a pitcher who is having career difficulties of his own. And it's so funny and so touching. And as the parent of an autistic kid, I just absolutely adored it.
Let's do an emotional 180 and talk about some of the books that you do not love, because you single out a few Holocaust books for criticism in your piece. And let's start with a title that people might be surprised you're critical of, because it looks like one of those books that every kid is assigned to read in school. It's called The Boy with the Striped Pajamas. What's wrong with that book? And what is it about for those who haven't read it?
So The Boy in the Striped Pajamas is about the son of a Nazi officer who repeatedly visits the fence of the concentration camp nearby and
the local concentration camp.
Yeah, the local concentration camp. And strikes up a friendship with a little Jewish boy. And this 9-year-old boy has no idea about what his father does or what's going on in the world. The aim of the book is noble. The aim of the book is to show that we can build bridges, that I believe the children are the future. But it is, see, I'm taking deep breaths as I talk to you because it makes me so angry. It's so irresponsibly done. If you're going to write a Holocaust book, history needs to come first. We can start from the top with there were no 9-year-old boys living in Auschwitz, because 9-year-old boys tend not to be able to do a lot of work, and 9-year-old boys they were gassed on arrival. You couldn't meet a kid at a fence because the fences were electrified. A 9-year-old Nazi commander's son would quite certainly know what his father did for a living. I think the statistic in the piece is something like 60% of German youth were in the Hitler Youth at that time. This idea of holy children's innocence is not healthy for anyone. The problem with wanting to show a happy ending, which is understandable because you want books to be age appropriate, is you are doing a disservice to history. Most of the endings are not happy. That one is really egregious.
Let's move quickly to a couple of books that do address the Holocaust well. And I think you and I share a favorite, which is Number the Stars by Lois Lowry.
We do. She's such a rigorous writer, and she doesn't bend truth for the sake of a story. She knows how important the history is. It is about a Danish non-Jewish girl who's friends with a Danish Jewish girl, and how she becomes aware of what's happening in the world and ends up working to protect her friend and then to get involved in the actual historical effort that Danish non-Jews engaged in to smuggle their Jews to Sweden. It's an amazing story, and she uses back matter to tell the true story and how her book works into it. I think it's pretty much a flawless book, but it does have a non-Jewish heroine. It's the story of a righteous Gentile. It's the story of a heroic rescuer. It's like the Jewish kiddie version of the Green Mile. We have to be very careful not to center the experiences of non-Jews when we tell Holocaust stories. The Holocaust is a Jewish story. Unless, of course, we're telling stories of Roma or LGBT people who were killed in the Holocaust. They also have the right to be centered. But I think we have a lot of righteous Gentile stories, and I'm wary. And I feel like once Lois Lowry wrote the perfect book, find a new territory to mine,
To echo the title of a novel by Nathan Englander, what we talk about when we talk about Anne Frank, let's talk about Anne Frank for a moment. Both the book itself, but also you mentioned in your essay that there were 5 picture books about Anne Frank that came out in a single year alone. Why picture books about Anne Frank, and what's right about that or wrong about that?
As far as I know, there have been 2 books told from the perspective of the tree outside Anne Frank's house, and at least 3 told by cats. The diary is a profound and important book on so many levels. But a thing to remember is Anne Frank wanted to be a writer. She wrote that diary in the hopes of publishing it after the war. I feel like it's an act of disrespect to her as an artist to tell her story in picture book form and end, as so many of them do, with this notion of, I still believe that people are good at heart. That should not be the takeaway. And if you're trying to put a happy ending on a story that ends the way Anne Frank's story did, you shouldn't be telling the story. I just remember for so many of us kids who grew up before this giant glut of Holocaust picture books, Anne Frank was one of our introductions to the literary treatment of the Holocaust. And it's a stunning book. And I feel like we should give her the respect of letting her tell her own story.
Let's end with one more book recommendation. You were a judge for the Sidney Taylor Book Awards. Which book won the medal?
So the winners this year were Welcoming Elijah, A Passover Tale with a Tale by the wonderful Leslie Ann Newman, which is the story of an extremely diverse Seder and a little kitten outside. We open the door for Elijah at the Seder. It's beautiful and funny, and she's a poet, and it reads like poetry. It is astounding. In the middle grade category, Turtle Boy by M. Evan Wolkenstein won, which is so funny and so weepy in a purifying way about a boy who has to do a mitzvah project for his bar mitzvah and his grudging volunteering that ends up being a really great thing for him. And he's called Turtle Boy both because he's obsessed with turtles and because he looks like a turtle, because he's facing facial surgery because of his very receding chin. It's autobiographical and it's so funny.
And for young adults?
The young adult medal went to Dancing at the Pity Party, which I think I mentioned, which is by Taylor Fetter. And it is so funny and so sad and so confidently illustrated. And it's really a meditation on grief, which is something we're afraid of, which is funny when we're all doing all these Holocaust books. But it's a tribute to her mom, and it's brilliant.
Marjorie Ingall is a former books and culture columnist for Tablet. She is the author of Mamala Knows Best, and our essay on children's books about the Holocaust and Judaism appears in the book review this week. Marjorie, thank you so much again for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Pamela.
Joining us now, my colleagues Jumana Khatib and Elizabeth Egan. Hey there.
Hi, Pamela.
Hello. Thank you for having us.
Jumana, it's been a while since you've been on the podcast. Tell us about what you've been reading.
Oh, well, thank you for having me back. It's a delight, always. So I actually am going to talk about a book that I just started this morning. I will say one thing I've totally missed about commuting is my subway reading time, but I've found a way to start it even at home. So I just started Ruth Ozeki's novel, A Tale for the Time Being, because I realized I needed some levity after reading a bunch of Janet Malcolm on the beach. I had a moment. I was like, I need some lightness here. so, so this book is about a woman named Ruth. So there is some sort of autofiction element going on. She sees this Hello Kitty lunchbox that washes up on the coast. She lives somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, and there are these diaries from a teenager in Tokyo, and they're actually very philosophical and they're very lighthearted. They really feel like an adolescent's voice. And she's such a funny narrator. And so I'm only a chapter or two into it, but I'm totally engrossed so far.
Have you read her before?
I haven't, but Liz actually was telling me when we were chatting beforehand that she loves Ruth Ozeki, right, Liz? You've read some of her stuff.
Yes, I read her, what I believe is her first book called My Year of Meat. It came out in 1998, and it's a novel about how animals are treated before they're slaughtered, basically. And it is so far ahead of its time. If you go back and take a look, you will not believe that this is a 20-plus-year-old book, and it's not as sad as it sounds.
I was going to say, it doesn't sound funny,
I know
especially.
you can't wait to read about slaughterhouses, but it's really, really good. And I haven't read her other books, but I've always intended to, and I'm a fan.
She has a book coming out this fall.
And I learned that she is a Zen priest, which is amazing. I don't know how many books by priests I read anymore now that I'm out of college. So, yeah, so that's been nice. It's a very soothing book. You might think a teenager would have a lot of adolescent roilings or something, but it's a very soothing and almost meditative book so far. So highly recommend it. But Liz, tell us about what you're reading these days.
Well, my book is not soothing. I would describe it as enraging. And it's an older book. It came out in 2009 called The Lost Child of Philomena Lee. It's the book that was turned into a movie called Philomena, starring Judi Dench. And it's by a British journalist named Martin Sixsmith. And it's a true story about an Irish girl named Philomena Lee, who in 1952 was pregnant. She was a teenager, and she was sent to live in what was essentially a workhouse in County Tipperary in Ireland, run by nuns until she had her baby. And to make a very long story short, this was a common practice in Ireland at the time. And she was able to be with her son until he was 3 years old. And then the nuns sent him off to Missouri, actually, to be adopted by a prominent Catholic family. The boy grew up mainly in Illinois, and Philomena remained at the convent and paid off her debt to the nuns, and then eventually left. And years passed, and her daughter reached out to Martin Sixsmith to ask him if he would help find this child that her mother had given up for adoption. The story is about how Philomena and her son, who in the United States became Michael Hess, how they search for each other for the rest of their lives. And the movie Philomena focuses very much on Philomena's perspective. But the book is actually mainly about the life of Martin Hess, which is fascinating in the sense that he grew up to become a very prominent lawyer in Washington. He worked for the Reagan and the Bush administrations as he was dying of AIDS, and also as his party and his employer was very slow to respond to the AIDS epidemic. I had seen the movie, and I'm really enjoying getting inside the head of Michael Hess in this book. I picked it up because I was actually writing something that is somewhat linked to this Irish practice that has thankfully ended of imprisoning wayward women in these, they were known as Magdalene laundries. And I picked it up intending just to dip into it, and I have not been able to put it down. It's incredibly sad, but also incredibly uplifting in the sense that it shows the strength of the bond between this mother and her son.
I read about neither priests nor nuns, but I'm going to talk about a book that I actually read a few months ago, and I've been meaning to talk about in the podcast. I was just looking for the right moment, I'm going to choose to align myself with Jumana in that this is a fun, lighthearted book. And I read it because our colleague Tina Jordan actually got me this book. It's called My Family and Other Animals by Gerald Durrell. And she was stupefied that I hadn't read it before. We were talking about books that are funny and books that are light. And no surprise, that's something that I think many of us were looking for during the pandemic. And that's when I read this book during the deep pandemic, still unvaccinated, on the one tiny little vacation that I took. And this book is about a family vacation. I was on a family vacation. I was not in Corfu, Greece, which is where this book takes place. Instead, I was in a not particularly nice corner of the Poconos, which there's just no comparison, okay? I'm sure there's lots of good things to say about the Poconos, but I'm not the person who's going to say those things. So it was nice to read about this idyllic island in Greece. And apparently this book has been turned into a PBS masterpiece series called The Durrells in Corfu. The book was published in 1958, and Gerald Durrell grew up to be a zoologist, and you can see where he got that in this book, which is about his family decamping from cold, damp British climes to Greece. And he's the youngest of 4 children, and he is obsessed with animals and insects. And he spends his days on this island tromping about with a magnifying glass, looking for horrible creatures and often bringing them back to the house and tormenting his older siblings with these horrible things that will end up in unexpected places in the house. And it's really funny. It's not just about insects and other things that bite. It's mostly about the siblings, and the mother is a widow, and the other siblings are much older than little Gerald, who I think is probably around 10 years old or so in the course of the book. It's been a few months since I've read it, so I don't remember the details, but I remember is very funny dialogue, really great characters. This is a book, if you liked Nina Stibbe's Love, Nina, that you would love this book.
Mm-hmm.
Oh my God.
Because
I have to read it.
Okay, you would love it, Liz. It's about very clever, often very biting, mean siblings that also love each other in that cold, bitter British way. And it's about an earlier era. This island in Greece, I'm sure, was less developed than the island of England at that time. And you kind of wish that it would have stayed that way in certain respects. It's very much life in a rural area, village life. Everyone seems to know everyone else, and just kind of full of local color. So I highly recommend it. I think there were follow-up books in the series. And then, of course, Durrell went on to write other books more specifically about non-human animals as well.
And the PBS series is amazing for what it's worth.
You've seen the series.
I've seen the series. I watched that in the dark days of the pandemic with my mother, who is a PBS aficionado, and it's actually hysterical. So if you're looking for a great after-book experience, I would highly recommend it.
All right, Jumana, you and I can switch places. I'll watch the TV show now, and you can read the book. And Liz, you can do both.
And you guys know that when Tina Jordan recommends that you do something or buy something or read something, you will do it. That's just how
drop everything.
Like, you will listen because she makes good recommendations. Yes, I will definitely read it. That sounds really good.
Yes, and I want to read actually a book that she's recommended about nuns, which is The Corner That Held Them. So I will move on to nuns soon.
She has recommended that one to me several times, and I've been somewhat disobedient. I can only handle so many books about nuns.
You need to space them out. Yeah, it's wise to take some time in between your nun books. So
definitely.
Let's run down the titles again. Jumana, what did you read?
So I am reading A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki.
I just finished The Lost Child of Philomena Lee by Martin Sixsmith.
And I finished a few months ago, but I still remember some of it very fondly, My Family and Other Animals by Gerald Durrell. Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.